All right, excellent. So thanks so much for your time. Thank you very much for the ESNEXT organizers and putting this event together. I'm super honored to be one of the selected speakers for this event. Yeah, looking forward to watching my talk and giving it, but also looking forward to watching the other talks as well. So I am just going to jump right in, and I am super passionate about this topic, which is open source and getting contributions, making contributions, and yeah, just happy to just have the opportunity to talk about this. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about something completely different, which is HBCUs. And I realized it's a global conference. I saw some of the speakers did come through. They had different flags than just an American flag, but this might be an American-centric slide, which is the historical black colleges and universities. This is, again, an American thing. We've had a lot of systematic things in the U.S., one being slavery, the other thing being everything else that came after slavery that we're still dealing with. So what came out of that, and a couple years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which is when Abraham Lincoln said, no more slavery, essentially, I guess, to summarize it really bluntly. 2 years after that, we had Juneteenth, which America just recently celebrated collectively, despite the fact that black individuals have been celebrating that for years. But that's besides near here there. That came 2 years later when the last slaves were finally told they were free. And then roughly 3 years after that, there was a college that was established, which is Hampton University, which is a historically black college. And that college itself produced Booker T. Washington, which is the godfather of the Tuskegee Institute. This is an institute for giving black Americans ability and access to information for just general things. Like the reason why we had so many hospitality staff and so many workers in houses and stuff like that, and like elevating us outside of just like crop and work and stuff like that. And I say us because I'm a black American as well. The Hampton University built that, but also the Tuskegee Institute built that. And like whether or not like keeping black Americans in service industries and stuff like that, whether that was right or wrong or whether that helped the culture or whatnot, I'm just basically setting up the stage to say it existed and that's what happened. And I really say all that because it, as I mentioned before, it was about access to information. Information that was not freely distributed, actually being able to have your quote-unquote American dream. There were systems in place and still are a few systems in place to oppress a few individual people or groups of people. And my whole talk is really about those systems. And I'm trying to just basically provide the information for anybody who's listening to this talk to have access to this information freely. So I'll get into that, but I also want to talk about my introduction to open source. So I've been programming professionally for roughly like 6.5, 7 years. I've been writing code a couple years before that. And, sorry. I'm going to kill the punchline. Sorry about that. We're going to do it live. But I want to talk really quickly about my path in open source. And my path in open source was, like many other people, pretty meandering, like not really sure what this is and how to get here. But my first introduction to programming was not JavaScript. It was actually a language, which was Ruby, which some of you are very familiar with because you use it on a day-to-day. And I had this task where we had this organization that we were trying to collectively put together, which was, we called it the Steamrollers. It was like a Slack group. At the time, Slack was super brand new. And I was happy to have this Slack group for black and brown engineers to talk to each other and find out different details of how to like be successful in tech. And that was the whole goal. And me being a new junior developer, just had taken my first junior developer job, was tasked to basically take that idea and automate the process of inviting people to Slack. So today you have like the Slack inviter, which I think Guillermo had originally created. Like that exists and it makes it a lot easier, and there's other tools that make it easier. Like Slack itself actually makes it easier to invite people into Slack now. So like these automation tools aren't necessary, but at the time it was a closed community where you had to invite manually each email. So I was trying to automate the piece of how do I get people into the community without manually checking every single person and then inviting them. So I looked for a lot of solutions, and at the time, my only solutions I had was in Ruby, and I attempted really hard to try to do that, to create a Ruby web server, to check a form, and then automate the process of inviting people. And then I stumbled up onto this one solution, which was Typeform and a Node server, which was the Slack inviter. And so I ended up going with it. I didn't know anything about, I knew about JavaScript, but I didn't know about server-side JavaScript, which is Node, which you can see in this is actually a screenshot of my email back in the day. And literally this guy, Chad, who had this project that I found on GitHub, I ended up finding his email on his GitHub profile. And not knowing how GitHub worked, I ended up just going to his email and emailing him directly rather than opening up issue or a PR or whatever it was. I didn't know how to even do that. I didn't know how to fork and do upstreams and all that other stuff. So I was learning literally as I was going along. And so I reached out to Chad, and he actually responded back to me and said, it's called Node. That's what you're looking at, and this is how it works. And we went through an entire weekend of back and forth for him just basically telling me how this project works and how Node works. And I was super appreciative. And we ended up finding getting the solution, getting it to work for what I was trying to get it to do. And at the very end of that conversation, he reached back and was just like, "Hey, sorry I've been slow to respond. I was actually at a K-pop concert in Thailand," which kind of blew my mind that he could take that time out of his day and essentially just mentor me into using the project that I did mention. He just kind of threw up on GitHub. Like, no one was really using it. It had like a handful of stars. And I just kind of jumped in, and I learned how to use JavaScript and Node properly. Well, I learned how to use Node properly, and super appreciative of his time. So I mentioned all this because open source, it's a big deal. There's a lot of companies who are using open source to power their infrastructure, power their code bases, power their front ends. It's pretty much ingrained in the way we operate as developers. And that's what this Black Duck, the survey results here. If I could summarize without reading each bullet point, that's what that says. And this says from Dice Jobs and the Linux Foundation, they did another survey where we just found out that companies value open source. So companies value open source, and so with that being said, open source is valuable to your career. So if you're not doing open source or not consuming open source or aware of how open source works, it could be detrimental to your career and your career growth. Yes, you could probably write all the stuff yourself, and that is all possible. It's also possible for everything to be closed source on a private repo, and your company never, look externally onto GitHub for anything or NPM for other stuff. So, but I mentioned that because I had a very long, meandering way of how I got to this place, but I work at GitHub. Most of you probably know what GitHub is. It's a collaboration platform tool for developers and also developer-adjacent folks like designers and product managers also use GitHub in different ways. But I've basically got to the point where now I'm a developer advocate for GitHub. And a lot of people don't know what developer advocacy is. I'll explain it. I'm essentially a Beyoncé advocate. I say this all the time because Beyoncé is a big deal in the music industry. She also has a very large community, and she advocates and goes to bat for the Hive, which is her community. I go to advocate and bat for developers. So if you have very nuanced questions and feature requests, I'm happy to triage those and take those inbound and then get those attention. So my DMs are open, so feel free to hit me up. I do want to point out too, this, though open source is pretty broad, I'm only going to cover these 3 projects because these are projects I have experience with. So just keep that in mind. But I just want to give a shout out to these projects because I think all these projects are doing it right as far as getting people onboarded and contributing into their projects. But I will say, for the majority of you projects, the path is broken. It's very unclear how to contribute. It's very unclear if the project needs contributions. So I've been using this term called unintentional gatekeeping, which is it's almost like unconscious bias. It's almost like you want to say something else, but you'll use this term. So unintentional gatekeeping is basically the fact that there's not enough breadcrumbs for someone to figure out whether or not they can contribute to this project and how. And I'll talk about those things by talking about the benefits. And that's sort of how I only have 25 minutes, so I'm going to focus on the benefits and how I successfully contribute to open source. But I also want to just recognize there are missing parts in getting this solved. And I think GitHub is obviously shipping features and they're I guess doing their best. I don't know if they're best as a large company making lots of money what their best actually quantifies as. But also I want to point out that it's also on the communities as well to adopt good practices as well. But as I mentioned, GitHub, it is a place to discover open source. I think that's kind of a well-known fact at this point. So I'm just pointing that out there. But every time I go to find an open source project and look to where to contribute, I tend to get really confused, get lost. There's not like each project doesn't treat their contributing MD the same. Some projects don't even use a contributing MD. They point you to another website or whatnot. And I like to use this quote all the time, which is, if you don't got sauce, then you lost. This is from the godfather of trap music. If you're unfamiliar with trap music is basically mumble rap. I think a lot of people are familiar with that because it's kind of a meme at this point. We're kind of 10 years away from mumble rap, and maybe 5 years away. But anyway, that exists. But I like this quote. This quote is taken from a YouTube interview, or an interview actually on Tumblr. But what is Tumblr these days, right? So this came from that interview between Gucci Mane and the interviewer, and basically asking, like, how do you have sauce? How do you have the ability, the skill to be able to make it as a rap mogul or a rap artist? Why am I saying rap artist? But anyway, a rapper. And basically his answer is, if you don't got sauce, then you lost. And I take that same sort of idea to open source because also it kind of sounds similar. So me personally, the way I get into open source is I built a tool to manage my open source contributions, and that tool looks like this, or at least this is what it looked like a couple years ago. When I first made it, it was simply just a Create React app that took the GitHub API, and then I was able to basically add repos to it. So that way, if I wanted to, these are all example repos other than Gatsby, but these were repos that I was looking to contribute to. And I needed to actually have the sort of like be able to set up a stage where every weekend, because usually it was the weekends when I contributed to projects, I needed some time just to like sit and think and then take notes on projects and then move forward to actually contributing to them. So I built OpenSauce to basically save and take notes to rediscover projects later. And if you don't mind, I'm going to talk about how I built this because this is like literally the backbone of my contributions. I built on the top of the GitHub GraphQL API. And it was intentional because at the time the GraphQL API was new and I wanted to learn how to use it. So I built like a pretty rough wrapper around the GraphQL API and then built a React app, as I showed before, where I could interact with the GitHub API, save repo data and notes through issues, which I'll talk about in a bit. And I did use a couple different solutions and open source projects to make this work, but I just want to point out OneGraph was the thing I sort of fell into eventually. And OneGraph is, if you haven't heard of OneGraph, you should definitely check them out. It's a place to co-locate all your GraphQL APIs, and then that way you have literally just one graph to consume. So like OpenSauce is powered by Twitch, and it also powered by GitHub, powered by GitHub's API, but it can also powered by the Twitch API as well. It also does a lot of cleverness to make REST APIs into GraphQL APIs, but I'll let OneGraph sell themselves on their documentation and their website. The one other thing I do want to point out too to make this easy is AuthGuardian. AuthGuardian's a nice little open source project. It's a little tool inside of the OneGraph client to basically take what you would, if you think of like Auth0, where it just makes authentication really, really easy. AuthGuardian is just like another feature inside of OneGraph to make all that co-locating of your data directly in the one place. So definitely check that out. I also wanted to mention too, I alluded to this, where all my note-taking is actually GitHub issues. So I'm using GitHub's API as my entire backend, but I'm not actually storing a database. I'm not keeping that data anywhere else. What I'm doing is just opening up a GitHub issue, keeping my notes there into this repo I'm calling OpenSauce Goals, and there you have it. And I also want to point out all this work is all open source. So if anybody's interested in using this, interested in contributing, definitely check it out. But now I'm going to basically move into the meat of the talk. And this talk is going to be organized in trying to solve these questions, which is who do I talk to? What do I work on? How do I work on this? And let me just jump into who do I talk to? I had an experience where I wanted to contribute to the graphical project, graphical being the IDE to basically consume GraphQL APIs and basically look through them and have like a a nice little playground for you, I guess playground per se, that was a thing, but able to check out your GraphQL queries and stuff like that in some sort of, again, a playground. And I wanted to contribute back because I knew Graphical just got moved to the GraphQL Foundation, and I saw there was a lot of issues open, and I took it upon myself to check out the /contribute. So if you don't know about this, any GitHub repo, if you go to /contribute, you get a list of unassigned good first issues, as well as documentation and help wanted, a couple other things. So definitely check it out for your repos. If you're a maintainer and nothing shows up here for your project, there's a good sign that you probably don't have anything for anybody to work on, or maybe you're not accepting contributors. So I've been using this in open source as a signal to see if projects actually are willing to take my contributions or are willing to see that. I've had other thoughts on this process. Perhaps projects that need help triaging or help project managing, which I'll get into in a sec. But my first step usually when I go to contribute is just check the contributing.md, which I did. And I found out, okay, well, you can check some issues, check out a PR. I ended up figuring out how to leverage. They have a development MD as well, which I was able to figure out how to locally clone the repo and get it to run. Like I figured it all out through the contributing MD. So that was like the central place. But the one thing that was missing was I ended up grabbing an issue to work on, and I debugged it and found out that the issue wasn't still valid. So my first inclination was like, hey, here's an entire list of stuff I tried. I don't think there's a valid issue. Just let me know if it is. And the best thing is that Ricky actually responded to me very quickly and was like, hey, I appreciate this. This issue is actually pretty old. We're going through this, and this, and here's the roadmap, and here's the project board, and here's this. So he was able to give me all that context. And this is where I was really, what I'm trying to get at is that there are certain people in the repo who have information, but it's not actually clear who does have the information, and sometimes you have to just put yourself out there. One of the benefits that I learned from this experience is that Graphical and GraphQL, the entire foundation, has a Discord. And at the time, I didn't really use Discord for anything besides, well, anything. And I was able to join the Discord and actually make a connection with Ricky and explain what I did and like give more detail that I didn't have in the issue. But I was able to make that connection. So now me and Ricky, we follow each other on Twitter. We're able to have conversations about this project. And that would have been, it's always a struggle walking into a project now, not knowing anybody or knowing where to start. And I appreciate individuals. Now this is in the contributing MD in the README, the Discord. But I encourage projects, if you do have a synchronous place to have conversations, please post that somewhere in your README. And if you don't, that's fine too as well. My next question is, what do I work on? And I think this could be summarized with a lot of different tools like opensource.guide, which is powered by GitHub, and GitHub, a team at GitHub as well, who just has a lot of guides of how to contribute, how to do your first contribution, where to look for your first contribution, like all that's sort of covered. And I think a lot of projects can do like a really good thing, and by just pointing people there or pointing people to a central location of steps on how to do the proper documentation, and like make sure their documentation adheres to this, like the central place. Because I think where I was getting with the HPCUs is that the access of information is really the issue here. Like most of these people who want to contribute to projects have competency in actually developing and can actually hold a full-time job as an engineer, but they don't have the information of like how does it work in open source. So I think us putting that information out there in our READMEs, in our documentation websites, it only betters the community going forward. Good first issue, another good thing. If you have a good first issue, label a good first issue. There's a project that's actually powered by another startup that provides good first issues, and you get like a digest of that pretty regular. I'm not sure how often it updates, but it gives you a digest of all the good first issues. Code triage, same thing, a digest of issues. Not technically good first issues, but it's a way for you to get updates and notifications via email of issues as they open and issues that you're looking to work on. So finally, the question of who do I talk to? And this is not moving to the next question. This is still, and what do I work on? And I just want to point out that going back to the first question, which is who do I talk to? Definitely talk to somebody. Go into the contributors and finding out whoever the top contributors are, or the last people who merged a PR, asking questions to them properly, which I want to mention, spam is not okay. So I would not recommend go to every top 100 GitHub repo by stars or whatever the metric you're looking for, and spamming each one of those projects and asking them, hey, can I work in your project? That's not the way to sort of get ingrained in the community. I would say also check the code of conduct. If they welcome questions and issues, they'll state that in their contributing MD, in their code of conduct. And if you aren't, I highly recommend you set your code of conduct up that you have expectations of how to interact with contributors, how to interact with issues, how to interact with pull requests. Because if you leave all that information out, no one knows where to start, and then everybody basically just makes it up as they go along. So no one wants spam, so let's all set up ways for us to prevent spam. I also want to point out non-code contributions is a thing that I could say that GitHub is working on. Like, writing code in open source is more than just getting a green square on your profile, and I think most of us at GitHub believe that too as well. But we do have a feature where you can have green squares in your profile. I do want to point out that there are other ways to contribute to the project. Like, I found a very old issue in Graphical that was able to be closed and squashed, and I got a couple other closed as well. If I could make it better for the next person trying to contribute to the project, then why not do that? And though I didn't get a green square on my repo, or sorry, my profile, I think I'm still better because of that interaction with the maintainer. So finally, I want to talk about how can you contribute? How can you work on stuff? I want to point out that Gatsby is doing a really great job. Gatsby has not only have a swag store that based on your contributions you get access to swag, but they also put themselves out there where you can actually get free pair programming sessions from Gatsby. So I highly recommend people check that out, take advantage of that. Gatsby is one of the earlier projects I contributed a couple years ago when I first started open source, and I'm a happy Gatsby user. I'm happy that they're doing stuff like this and providing a path. I also want to point out Express.js. They have a triage team, which they have a whole talk about that at the Node Summit. Wes, I talk about this a lot because I'm just really impressed with the fact that they have a triage team, which is, again, non-code contributions, but a onboarding path for developers to be a part of the community and part of the platform. If you have enough issues, if you have a big enough team, I highly recommend provide that junior experience to the, not developer experience, but junior experience to the community where people can just label stuff. They can mark old stuff like closed. They can triage. They can be the first one to triage an issue. Like, all that stuff is super valuable for a community to actually grow and be sustainable. And I talk about mentorship, but I want to briefly talk about sponsorship because I honestly think sponsorship is the way to go if you really want to invest in your community and have it sustainable. GitHub sponsors is a thing. And I think what happened when GitHub sponsorship was something that a lot of people had complaints about when it first came out, which was basically all the top maintainers are now sponsors, and then we sponsor the same people, and like the same 100 people are now elevated. And like, that's obviously a problem. Like, I don't think that individuals who are in the top 100 list of maintainers on GitHub are there by chance. I think they're there because they put a lot of effort into what they do, and people are rewarding them from that. But my question is, how do we get more people in the fold? How do we grow community? How do we get access to information? And that's what I did. This is a tweet I sent out a couple weeks ago, actually last month. And it was just mainly out of my frustration and like how the world was happening, how the protests were happening, at least in the US. And I wanted to do something to better my community. So I reached out and said, if anybody who identifies as Black and is part of GitHub sponsors, I will sponsor you. And I ended up being overwhelmed with the response too as well. I ended up sponsoring most of the people who responded. And some of these people responded back to me and saying that it literally changed their life. Like, they were making $0 as a developer, and now they're making more. So putting that value and that investment, like, these are people I talk to as well on a regular basis too. Now I do. And I'm able to provide that access to information to them. So finally, I just want to shout out, I put a lot of these sponsors that I reached out to that I'm invested in as far as open source goes here in the Awesome Black Developers repo. So definitely check that out. And I also want to point out that this is not about money. This is about access. So you don't have to sponsor anybody like you with money. Like, you could sponsor them with your time. You could sponsor and invest in their career growth. So if you're a maintainer or contributor, if you're just a really good developer, like, sharing access to your information is really hands down what's going to make this a better situation for all of us. Also, want to briefly mention Floss and Code. It's a thing I did with the GitHub Black Accounts. It was a Black ERG. We went to HBCUs and we taught them how to do open source. And the goal really was just to teach them that there was access to information that they weren't getting in their regular curriculum as CS students. So we set up this Floss and Code program where we go to HBCUs, teach them open source. And the first one we did was actually in Atlanta. Atlanta is an interesting place, which is a thriving tech community. But whatever reason, every time I go to an event there, it's always in the suburbs of Atlanta. So we intentionally wanted to go to East Atlanta, where we know there's a high black population, high population of HBCU grads and students. And we were able to ship Hack Day, where we had open source maintainers provide in-person talks and mentorship and actually ship code. If you don't know Shelly, definitely know Shelly from Electron. She was in-house. This is Noel. Noel had a merge of GitHub Desktop, which is also open source. And again, this was about freely distributing information that wasn't readily available to specifically CS students and HBCUs. Like, there's an opportunity for us to actually reach out as open source contributors, maintainers, participants. There's a quote that I'll end on, which is, it's a cruel jest to say that to a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps when he has no boots. And I sort of paraphrase that because I'm sort of rushing through and trying to land this plane. But I just want to consider, like, open source and contributing to code is more than just the code. It's really about the community. And you see countless times projects that have a strong community that don't have the best code strive. You see it in a bunch of languages outside of JavaScript. And I think I would really say, let's consider that in the way we approach open source as well. I try to bring that Floss and Code experience once a week on Fridays to my Twitch stream. So I highly recommend if you're into Twitch and watching people code or into open source, come watch me on Twitch. Come join my community, which is the open source community. I do have a Twitter, which I'll show. But I think if I could say anything and end this hopefully soon, which is end the gatekeeping and let's start sponsoring. Let's invest in the communities. I do have a weekly newsletter, which is listing out good first issues for my community, so that way I can mentor people and coach them on how to contribute to it. I do tweet that out on a weekly basis on Sauced Open, which is twitter.com/saucedopen. So follow there. And again, let's give access to open source. Let's make it free. Let's make it accessible to all. I'm BDougieO on Twitter, and I'm BDougie on GitHub. Thank you very much for your time.